Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's edition of Campus Literature Week. This year, our theme is celebrating local writers, where we celebrate the works of our regional treasures. We are dedicating today's lunchtime readings to departed literary legends from the UE Department of Literary, Cultural, and Communication Studies. So it's very much a beautiful day for us here. Our first reading will come from Dr. Elizabeth Jackson, and she'll be reading the works of Dr. Giselle Rampol. Dr. Rampol was a leading expert on Caribbean rereadings of Shakespeare. She was also the founder and producer of the Spaces Between Words, Conversations with Writers. That was a podcast series which has released interviews with 97 writers and poets. One of the many highlights of her career is having partnered with the British Council and Shakespeare scholars from Barbados, Cuba, and Jamaica on related projects. She was also instrumental in the founding of the Red Feather Journal, an international journal of children in popular culture, in 2010. She co-edited The Child and the Caribbean Imagination in 2012 and Postscripts, Caribbean Perspectives on the British Canon from Shakespeare to Dickens in 2014. She has also authored numerous journal articles. And so we welcome Dr. Jackson.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to be reading a work from my dear friend and colleague, Giselle Rampol. The selection that I've chosen today to read to you is from her edited collection, Postscripts, Caribbean Perspectives on the British Canon from Shakespeare to Dickens, edited by Giselle and Barbara Lala in 2014. Extract I've chosen is from Giselle's own chapter in this collection called Strange Creatures and Fantastic Worlds, the other in selected 19th century children's texts. Reason I've chosen this essay is I think it's a beautiful example of so much that I loved and admired about Giselle. It shows her solid scholarship, her wide knowledge, her critical thinking, and her beautiful writing style, all of which I always admired. So I'm not going to read you the entire chapter. It would take too long. I have picked out some bits for you, which I have been told hang together coherently. So having practice. So without further ado, I'm going to begin from the beginning and then not skip around, but skip forward a little bit to read to you the bits which I think you would find the most interesting. So this is Giselle's voice. Since its discovery and colonization, the Caribbean has always been a subject of the British literary imagination. Although this is clear in canonical texts, books written by adults that have been the usual subjects of critical scrutiny, representations of the Caribbean in children's literature are not often the focus of attention, owing to what Peter Hunt and Karen Sands refer to as colonial blindness in the criticism of children's literature. Although children's books always fundamentally involved in reflecting and transmitting culture, were the witting or unwitting agents of the empire builders. In this chapter, I would like to focus on a few canonical texts emerging in the 19th century, considered the golden age of children's literature. Although these texts do not all specifically make references to the Caribbean, reading them with British imperialism and the colonization of the Caribbean in mind helps to contextualize the ways in which ideas of difference and discovery were treated in children's books. These books were important because they had a cultural and imperial agenda and perpetuated ideas and ideals about British civilization in the face of newly discovered places and people. According to Mary Louise Pratt, books written by Europeans about non-European parts of the world created the imperial order for Europeans at home and gave them their place in it. Excuse me. Children's books especially helped to consolidate the superiority of the British and the primitivism of the colonized in the minds of the next generation. This chapter will thus examine the ways in which other landscapes and peoples were constructed in selected children's texts. Skipping forward a little bit here, and I won't keep telling you when I'm skipping forward, I'll just do it. I should take the publication of Robinson Crusoe as my starting point for an examination of how the Caribbean informed perceptions of exoticism and difference in 19th century children's texts for a few reasons. Robinson Crusoe has long been regarded as the first English novel. Its publication date of 1719 is considered the birth date of the novel. Moreover, although emerging as a book written for adults, Robinson Crusoe found its way eventually to children's libraries and became a children's classic. I've marked where I'm reading next, and I'm trying to find it. Okay. Okay. Of course, Robinson Crusoe is also an obvious beginning point to examine how constructions of the Caribbean influence subsequent children's books, because it is known for the Caribbean island setting in which most of the action takes place, and for the colonization of the Amerindian Trident. But it is also the first novel that sets itself in the New World, according to Barish Ali, and one of the great cultural repositories of the imagery of empire, according to Rashna Singh. Still, as Peter Holm points out, the novel has not traditionally been seen as a Caribbean book, although Holm himself, like this chapter, tries to return it to the Caribbean. Another novel that was a contemporary of Robinson Crusoe and that made the crossover from a book for adults to a children's classic is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, 1726, a parody of the very genre of travel writing to which Defoe's novel belonged. Both novels, as adventure tales, had an interesting relationship with realism and fantasy, and it is instructive to examine not only the effects Robinson Crusoe had on Gulliver's Travels as material for a parody, but also the ways in which the latter illuminates the fantasy elements of the former. Children's literature as a separate genre of writing catering specifically to a child audience or reader only developed in the 19th century. And this development was simultaneous with the fantasy genre coming into being. But these 18th century novels were already experimenting with the creation of fantastic worlds. And it is the aim of this chapter, especially, to examine the ways in which Defoe created a fantasy of the Caribbean that had such an enduring influence on later fantasy novels. Both novels, therefore, contributed to the development of the fantastic yet realistic world of the adventure tale, and the desert island of Defoe's novel and the miniature and other imaginary worlds in Swift's have influenced numerous subsequent adult and children's books. Now, clearly, Defoe's setting of the Caribbean was more real than Swift's fictional lands. Swift's novel was, after all, a satire, and therefore it employed gross exaggeration to parodic effect. However, although Defoe is careful to give us details about the position of Crusoe's island to suggest its actual existence in the Caribbean, and although Robinson Crusoe has been hailed as the forerunner of modern realistic fiction, the island itself was a figment of the imagination. Furthermore, both novels depict British protagonists sailing to far-off lands and encountering strange and exotic peoples and landscapes, then describing them in minute detail so that the reader, through the first-person narrative perspective, could see what the protagonists saw, experiencing these worlds through the dominant perceptual and conceptual perspectives of the British sailors. These detailed descriptions contributed to the realistic settings and characters, but the distance from the ordinary and familiar setting of Britain helped to construct these places as otherworldly, as places that the British reading public could only access through imaginative complicity with the narrators of these texts. These settings were therefore more fantastic than the familiar solidity of everyday Britain. In this way, the novels established ideas of a stable home, Britain, and of foreign lands beyond the seas that were constructed as at once realistic and fantastic. As Cutsor explains, in adventure fiction, we appear still to be in the real world, but one that provides much more excitement and exoticism than can be found in dreary and domesticated England. The treatment of foreign lands as both realistic and fantastic is common in fiction of empire. Holm has also described Robinson Crusoe as a colonial romance and colonial fantasy for several reasons, not least its utopianism. Cutsor further argues that the story of empire is often presented as a kind of fairy tale, in which the valiant but unrecognized hero travels to strange realms, overcomes obstacles and villains, all in order to reach the pot of gold at the end. Crusoe does indeed gain wealth from his estates in Brazil at the end of the novel, and it was in the spirit of adventure, which Holm argues is synonymous with the quest for treasure, that both Crusoe and Gulliver set out from Britain to explore the world. And this was certainly the story of several other characters that would appear in 19th century boys' adventure tales. The influence of Robinson Crusoe on the establishment of a literary fantasy of the Caribbean, therefore, cannot be overlooked. So this is a good place for me to stop, but I recommend you read this whole essay. Giselle goes on to talk about the strange islands and adventures in boys' adventure tales, in later writings, and so on. It is so instructive and so beautifully written. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Jackson. And we'd like to welcome our online audience who have joined us in this time. You're watching Campus Literature Week 2023, and we thank our in-person audience for taking the time to be with us. Please remember to silence your phones if you haven't done so already. Our next reader will be Dr. Geraldine Skeet, and she'll be reading the works of Dr. Louis Regis. Dr. Regis was an inspiring teacher and leading expert on Calypso. He was the author of numerous academic articles and several books. His three major titles are Race, Ethnicity, and Nationalism in the Trinidad and Tobago Calypso, 1970 to 1998. That was in 2017. Black Stallion, Calypsonian, published in 2007. And The Political Calypso, True Opposition in Trinidad and Tobago, published in 1998. He helped change the ways in which our culture is integrated into the education system, and his reach was keenly felt at the secondary and tertiary levels. And so we welcome Dr. Geraldine Skeet.
Good afternoon, everyone, to the audience, in-person audience, and those who are online. It's a pleasure and honor to read the words of Dr. Louis Regis. I knew Louis since I was 17 years old when he was my A-level teacher. He taught me books like Julius Caesar and A Farewell to Aunts, for Shakespeare and Ernest Hemingway. At that time, I had bought his book on Maestro, that he had written on Maestro. So I've known him since 1983. Then a decade later, I was leaving in my final year of my BA degree. I was walking out of the campus and he was walking in because he was doing some part-time teaching here. And so he didn't teach me here at UWI, but we became colleagues. And then in the Literatures and English section, and then he was my head of department when the Department of Liberal Arts split into the Department of Literary, Cultural and Communication Studies and the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. Of course, Louis was a scholar of literary studies and cultural studies, the latter due to the influence of Professor Gordon Rolle, who we'll also be honoring today. And the author description, I'm going to read from two of his works on Black Stalin. Black Stalin, as we know, passed away recently, so I thought it very relevant and appropriate to read Louis' words, right? Louis' work on Black Stalin. And the author description for Black Stalin, the Caribbean Man, which was published in 1987, it's noted that the author, Louis Regis, likes to be called, quote unquote, a student of Calypso. He has so far published one booklet on Calypso entitled The Maestro, the True Master, and is at present doing a study on Carnival. So this was 1987. And so he did interviews with Black Stalin on the 26th of March, 1985, the 19th of February, 1986, the 28th of February, 1986, 7th March, 1986, and 4th August, 1986. And he did personal recorded discussions with Professor Rolle, Zeno Constance, and Dennis Paul. And he also, so this is his bibliography for Black Stalin, the Caribbean Man. He also used Zeno Obi Constance's Valentino, Poet and Prophet, and Gordon Rolle's Man Talking to Man, Calypso, and the Social Confrontation in Trinidad, 1970 to the present, and another paper on Introduction to the History of the Calypso. So those two by Gordon Rolle. In the updated version of Black Stalin, the Caribbean Man, Black Stalin, Caisonian, the author description for Louis is Louis Regis is a student of Calypso. He holds a doctorate in Calypso research from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and is the author of the political Calypso, the opposition in Trinidad and Tobago, 1962 to 1987. So I'm paying homage to Louis and also to his, I became acquainted over the years with his wife, Dr. Fern Luan Regis, and their children, Posey and Kaya, so this is for them as well. Louis here at the university, Louis taught West Indian poetry, West Indian short story, among other courses. So I will want to read just the first paragraphs from the introduction of Black Stalin, the Caribbean Man, and just brief excerpts from the conclusion. And then, depending on time, I'll read the intro and conclusion from Black Stalin, Caisonian. So this is Louis, Black Stalin, the Caribbean Man introduction. Black Stalin, Leroy Calise, is undoubtedly one of the most intriguing Calypsonians of the modern era. Immensely popular with audiences as varied as the volatile Skinner Park crowd, journalists, patrons at the Carnival Development Committee's The Marsh Brush Show, researchers, writers of letters to the editors of the local dailies, and a great many Calypso lovers. This dynamic Calypsonian has done a lot to preserve in the modern Calypso, searching and fearless Calypso political commentary, spiced with an ironic, sometimes acerbic wit. I confess to being a Stalin fan of many years, dating back to 1969, when he rendered The Message of Martin Luther King. Here, I intend to present a biography and a study of this remarkable Calypsonian, although I have emphasized the ideas and currents of thought in his Calypso, rather than the personal elements of his life. Because of this focus, I have discussed his works thematically, looking at Stalin in his roles as Black nationalist and Rastafari, as patriot, and as man of the arts, including as a chapter on an interview which we had done in 1985 in preparation for a paper, The Calypso and its Relationship to the Steel Band. The order is suggested by the relative importance and the stress in the Calypsos themselves. I would like to pay tribute to the many people who have assisted and encouraged me in my research. In particular, Professor Gordon Rolle, my mentor, my colleague and friend, Zeno Obi Constance, who on hearing of my decision to write a book on Stalin, immediately submitted to me a comprehensive Stalin discography, plus cassettes and written transcripts of his lyrics. Dennis Hall of Sprangalang fame, who spends many hours discussing Calypso with me, Mandela, and Happy of the Network Rhythm Band, who have supported me, Carlisle Ledgerwood, my friend and the artist, who did the cover design as he had done with my first book, Maestro, the True Master, my family, who have stood with me throughout, and especially Stalin and his family, Patsy, Shaka, Abiola, and Kenya, for their time and patience and for their courteous treatment shown me during the many interviews that we had. On 24 September 1941, the Caliste family of 9 Chisholm Street, San Fernando, welcomed to this world their second son and third child, Leroy. A few years later, the family comprising children Dennis, Yvonne, Leroy, and Gloria took up residence at Coffee Street, and young Leroy grew up in the Free French Panya because his first and only babysitter, Dennis, was a panman. And as babysitters of poor families are generally elder children who simply take their charges wherever they go, Leroy spent most of his days as a little fellow in and among the streets of the Coffee, and especially in the company of the Free French panmen, including Zola Williams and Theo Stevens. In the conclusion, he says, Black Stalin's a true Caisonian. Even his detractors, those who dislike him as an individual, acknowledge that in matters of calypso, he is a professional. He definitely lacks a sweet, melodious voice and a slick performing style, but on stage he radiates raw energy, which together with his forceful stage personality more than compensates for this want of polish and make him irresistible. So I'll just skip a few with regard to his own words, Stalin's own words, the role of the Calypsonian. He has presented a view of the Calypsonian as the one who refines and promotes the language of the people. This is a quote from Stalin: as composer and man living with and talking with people, you have to understand what I sing is the people own, is them thing. All I doing is take it up, nice it up, and hand it back to them. Cook it nice, fix it up sweet. So I got to find the correct kind of seasoning to put in it. And I'll go to the last paragraph. Black Stalin, one of the people dedicated to bridging the gap between the calypso as education and entertainment. That's what he's saying, thus Black Stalin speaks, or that he had said in the quotation earlier. Quote. A fighter coming from a home where conditions were not, quote unquote, conditions were not so nice, unquote. He is determined to do what it takes to achieve the goals he has set for himself and for the calypso. In Caisonian, the introduction, it says, it is generally agreed that Black Stalin, Leroy Caliste, is one of the major exponents of the traditional Caiso and has been such throughout his career. Immensely popular with audiences at home, throughout the islands, and in the metropolitan centers where he performs. Stalin testifies in and through song to the power of the traditional calypso by providing insightful social and political commentary, spiced with an ironic and sometimes acerbic wit. He has been faulted for a lack of melodic variety, but no one who has seen him at the tent in concert and competing for the National Calypso Monarch title can fail to be impressed by the range of performance styles of which he is master. Images of him dancing defiance in More Come, joyously celebrating successful marriage in A Field to Party, or mischievously performing the picong of Wine Boy, alternate with those of the reflective eulogy to Martin Luther King and the intimate somber rapping of Nothing Ends Strange or Pangon. For every song and stage, there seems to be a matching style, and every audience is given royal treatment. A national calypso monarch many times over, Stalin has not lost the common touch and remains rooted in South Trinidad in San Fernando, his birthplace, where he exercises his right to belong by fitting comfortably into the Lord Street line at Tam Wheeler's night spot. Up to 2001, this line enlivened it with energetic demonstrations of iron beating to calypso music, the dismal charade that passes for nightlife in that so-called city. Also, he often slips unannounced into the San Fernando-based Caiso showcase tent in silent tribute to the Calypsonians who carry on the tradition in which he was nurtured. Although I have been a Stalin fan since 1969 when he rendered the immortal message of Martin Luther King, my first meeting with him was sometime in the mid-70s in the lines at the home of Squibby, his former review colleague. Listening to him talk, then I began to understand aspects of his personality and further to appreciate how much of those aspects are faithfully reflected in his calypsos. In 1985, when I was researching for an unpublished paper, the calypso and its relationship with the steel band, I interviewed him because I thought that his Pango in 1974 and Where I Band 1981 were critical to the study. So impressed was I by his perspective on the steel band that I proposed writing a monograph on him, a project he endorsed enthusiastically. I remember being unaccountably nervous at our first interview for this project, February 19, 1986. When I somewhat abruptly proposed that we begin, he calmly suggested that we, meaning me, take it easy before proceeding. The product of that venture was Black Stalin, the Caribbean Man, published in 1987. I will need to skip, and I'll just go to, I would have loved to have read the entire introduction and conclusion to Stalin Kaisunian, but let me just skip to the introduction, because I know my time is limited. Right. Stalin firmly believes that the calypso is essentially a medium of communication, and that the calypsonian is one who passes on the message in ways which his public can easily understand and relate to. So I'll skip the quote from Stalin. Stalin perceives the calypso as employing a changing vocabulary as a means of resisting the hegemony of the English language. Despite Vampire Year, Burn Them, Smelling It, and a few other sterling examples of extended metaphor, however, Stalin does not, quote unquote, cook the popular language nice. He is better known for the persuasive logic of his rap, a range of discourse including elegy, panegyric, exhortation, harangue, the constructive reproach, the sober warning, and rhetorical defiance. Being in touch with the people at their level, he taps into popular speech and employs current phrases as key lines of his messages. And I'm going to skip a bit. I really want to read this part. Interestingly, Stalin has never participated in any of the many independence calypso monarch competitions held to date. When I pressed him on this matter, he revealed that he had never done any material for that occasion, and further that he never composed anything on Christmas. These are Stalin's words. Independence and Christmas. I never do no material for these two festivals. You know, and as I always tell you, I have to believe in something to do a topic. And if I'm not 100% on a topic, I wouldn't write it then. Who knows? Maybe that's how I feel about Christmas and that independence. I doesn't really want to sing about Christmas. It have me tie up then. It lost me somewhere between the little boy born in a place and coming down to where they tie me up with Father Christmas and a whole set of things. I'd rather leave that alone. And this so-called independence thing, that is another problem I have. I never get over what happened in Marlborough House, whether it's a real thing or what that whole independence thing is about. You know, I can't understand independence and how you have to beg. I can't understand the two. Unquote. And so in other words, total commitment or nothing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Geraldine Skeet. Our next reader will be Dr. Hannah Regis. Dr. Regis will be reading the works of Dr. Jennifer Rahim. Dr. Jennifer Rahim was a Trinidadian fiction writer, poet, and literary critic. Her 2009 poetry collection, Approaching Sabbaths, received a Casa de las Americas Prize in 2010 for Best Book in the category Caribbean Literature in English or Creole. She co-edited with Barbara Lalla the collection of essays Beyond Borders, Cross-Culturalism, and the Caribbean Canon. And of all our literary giants being celebrated today, Dr. Rahim is the one most recently passed, and so the grief for her is still quite fresh. And so this is really such a special day for our department. So please welcome Dr. Hannah Regis as she reads the works of Dr. Jennifer Rahim.
Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to read for you an extract from the novel Goodbye Bee by Jennifer Rahim. Dr. Rahim was my teacher, beloved colleague, and friend. It is 1963, 1 year post-independence. Makaima is a fictional Trinidadian village in a declining cocoa-producing district that is haunted by a story of violations suffered by the island's indigenous peoples. Annabelle Bridge Mohan leaves Port of Spain to begin a temporary job there as postmistress in the hope of finding new direction for her life. The extract is taken from a meeting organized by the Women's Coalition of the ruling party. Brenda Moses upstages the meeting and opens the way for Anna's own questioning and growing self-awareness. Minutes before 4 o'clock, the coalition rode in the modest motorcade of 2 or 3 cars and a minivan. The woman, serious-faced and purposeful, accessed the venue. After a brief exchange with one of the leaders, Franco left with his workmen in trail. 3 women took their positions at the head table, exuding confidence as they exchanged whispered comments at the gathering. Bodies were harnessed in tailored skirts and sleeveless bodices in checkered and floral prints, matching accessories, lightly styled hair, bright lipsticks, and stylish stilettos and pumps. The coalition's lesser bedecked supporters in maidenly skirts and blouses filed into the seats behind Ms. Gomez. A little after 4:10, we were encouraged to come closer. Ms. Gomez frisked from her seat as though she had been paid a personal compliment. Baby and Deborah exchanged hushed comments, mischief playing on their faces. Ms. Gomez fussed some more. A few of the accompanying members tried to draw the rest of us in. Nobody moved. The majority remained on the outskirts, looking on, stubbornly non-compliant, even as urgent deliberations ensued among the lead members. They wanted to begin. The main speaker, a Mrs. Somebody, adjusted her posture in her seat, dusted away something from the surface of the large notepad on her lap. The woman seated to her right blotted perspiration from her brow with tissue paper that left white specks behind. Another invitation was issued for us to draw nearer. I decided it was time to yield, but wondered at the reluctance of the other woman. It wasn't exactly shyness or timidity. Brenda remained where she was, Alicia and Obadiah beside her. A round of applause ensued, the cadence unsteady. We waited. Introductions were made. We learned that the main speaker was a Mrs. Alfonso. Mrs. Otley directed an appreciative round of applause her way. Mrs. Otley spent considerable time outlining the important role the coalition had played in winning votes for the election that freed the country from England. She reminded us that its members were the invisible backbone of that victory, its indispensable foot soldiers, and so on. The party had them in its debt. The members clapped and nodded their agreement. Mrs. Alfonso rose and directed her applause to the members in white before she indicated to Mrs. Otley that she wanted to say something to the gathering. Mrs. Otley gave way, returning to her seat. Sisters, ladies, women of Makaima, I want you to feel comfortable and at home. I want you to know that the Women's Coalition of the People's Independence Party is interested in human rights. And we are dedicated to improving the condition of women throughout this blessed nation. Be assured, our meetings are meant to foster unity and to support those in cabinet whose appointed task is to lead. Do not be afraid. We are not unbridled feminists. So ladies, let us get to work. Unity is strength. Welcome. Her comments were intended to put the gathering at ease, but they served more to unsettle. Amid the general shifting were whispered queries about the word feminist. Mrs. Otley was instructed to carry on as planned. All were invited to stand for the coalition's prayer. Members passed around printed copies. The head table rose in unison, raising her voice to a pitch that she felt would not just be heard but command attention. Mrs. Otley began, "O Almighty and wise God, we dedicate this meeting to thy care and guidance. Unite our hearts in the oneness of purpose," and so on and so on. Each word was precisely enunciated in a way that distracted more than invited real listening for being so forced. But the moment was Mrs. Otley's. She prayed on, keep us, O Lord, from pettiness. Let us be large in thought, word, and deed. Let us be done with fault finding and leave off self-seeking, and so on and so on. Things, however, started to collapse with the reading of each verse of the prayer, some of which I recognized but could not immediately identify the source. Not a sound came from the gathering, not until the first "oh no," almost inaudible, intruded. Mrs. Otley scanned the small gathering as if to reassure herself that she had been mistaken. Someone could not be attempting to interrupt her prayer. She continued, may we put all pretense aside and meet each other face to face, and so on and so on. It was in truth a very long prayer and maybe too ambitious in the work it had set out to do. With every verse, every petition, the voice from the back of the meeting grew more insistent with its "oh no." Some paused from their conscientious following of the words on the slip of paper in their hands. Others opened their eyes that were squeezed closed in a show of concentrated sincerity. They looked about them to ascertain the source of the disturbance. Mrs. Otley would not be fazed. She persisted with what she had been elected to do, pushed through to the very end. We saw Mrs. Otley's eyes change from a disbelieving squint to oversized buttons of alarm trained on the woman standing at the back who had suddenly become front and center stage of the meeting's gaze. Pushing against the surging current of disagreement, she read on and on in denial of the protest that was brewing. She lifted her voice to a shouting pitch in an effort to drown out the protester, but to no avail. A hurricane was on its way. I say no. What on earth are you telling me here today? Not me, I, Brenda Solomon, who just walked out to estate life and into this place we call independence. You cannot expect me to be a handmaid for no damn party. Oh no, not today, not I, not me, not we, who had to make a study of pretense, playing quiet, calm and gentle in the face of plain selfishness and bold-faced injustice. You not ready for we. Brenda untied the wrap that bound her hair to signal she was done. She grabbed her children by both arms and stormed away. Mitchell blew his horn. Sandra knew it was time to go. Lucille, who had been silent throughout the whole turmoil, looked directly at Mrs. Alfonso, her eyes ablaze. She too walked away. We all looked on, stunned. The members at the head table froze, speechless. That was the end of the meeting, or you might say, the start of something else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was Dr. Hannah Riches reading the works of Dr. Jennifer Rahim. Our final reader for today, the Professor Emeritus Kenneth Ramchand. He'll be reading the works of Professor Gordon Roulaire. And Professor Roulaire was a Guyana-born scholar and critic of West Indian literature, noted for his study of popular culture in the Caribbean, including oral poetry, calypso, and cricket. He pioneered the academic and intellectual study of calypso, tracing its history over several centuries, writing a landmark work entitled Calypso and Society in Pre-Independence Trinidad, published in 1989, and is considered the world's leading authority on its development. And so we have Professor Emeritus Kenneth Ramchand reading from the works of his dear friend and colleague, Professor Gordon Roulaire. Professor Ramchand.
Thank you very much. I'm doing two passages from Gordon Roulaire's work. The first comes, of course, from Calypso and Society in Pre-Independence Trinidad. And it covers Professor Roulaire's discussion of how Calypsonian Theophilus Phillips, the mighty spoiler, how the mighty spoiler abandoned observable social reality and entered a bizarre region of the mind. My second reading comes from an essay in The Shape of That Hurt, and it too is an exploration of the creative mind. Spoilers, I do have a Gayatri accent, so I can't do it. Spoilers calypsos deal with sudden reversals of reality, as in Foundation of Youth, Cat Brain himself told himself. They deal with strange incursions of the insane or abnormal into the normal world, as in teaching a madman to drive, sleepwalking, what the scientists say. They deal with reality perceived with an astigmatic eye, where inter-island rivalry is presented as a quarrel among various realms. This set includes All Fools Day, Father Christmas, 1959, and Money in the Bank. Is me now. In Money in the Bank, Melody tells about the speaker's difficulty accessing his money in the bank. Just because I have my money in the bank since my age was 9, all them big shot put theirs on top of mine. I have to wait again just a couple of years. To get out mine, they have to take out theirs. As time passes, rich people are putting more and more money on the top of Melody's cash. And the cashier reports without sympathy that it is almost impossible to reach down to the bottom of the pile for it. Roulette suggests that Money in the Bank is a good introduction into the peculiar world of spoilers calypsos. The speaker in the poem decides at last he's not going to go crazy with worry. He will practice the patience of Job. He can't get his cash to buy big fat turkey like rich people, and he resigns himself to continue as usual on his accustomed diet of Vaseline and camphor ball stew. Roulette takes delight in the calypso, and his analysis and description are aware of its multiple implications. Roulette. Money in the Bank is on one level a richly comic tale based on the obvious paradox that the protagonist's frustration, near derangement, and ultimate tragicomic resolve to live out his trials with the patience of Job all spring from his good fortune in having had a generous bequest of money deposited in the bank from the time he was 9 years old. The comedy is, however, made poignant when one considers that everyone knew that Spoiler had no money. Melody's memory of him is of one who lived a bohemian life, had no rich relatives, had in fact been disowned by his father, a railroad official who was ashamed that his son Theophilus had taken to singing calypsos, drowning his cadaverous frame in rum, and living with the Jamet women of San Fernando and Port of Spain. Gordon really enjoyed it. At another level, this is a marvelous new folk tale of the 1950s, of the small man's growing impotence under the weight of big capital. It took a person whose vision came from the uttermost margin of society to see what was happening with such clarity that he could laugh dryly at his own and the society's desperate helplessness. In Spoiler's parable of the absurd, the investment of the small man is smothered and absorbed by the weight of big bucks until it can no longer be retrieved from its place at the bottom of the vault where it is buried. He becomes frustrated not because he has no money, but because his money is now so entangled in the vast machinery of an all-alienating system which he is too small to control, that he cannot put it in motion to work for him. The arrogant cashier, whose job in the 50s was regarded as a prestigious one and reserved for the daughters of the ruling elite, controls his life, lowering or raising his expectations at will. He finally succumbs to fatalism, the profound long-suffering of Job, the weird and dangerous diet of survivalism, which contrasted with the fat Christmas turkey that he has never enjoyed, will either destroy his health or preserve him in a state of hardy emaciation. Coming in an era when capital had begun to illustrate its enormous power to refashion consolidated images and structures or create ones after its own color and likeness, Spoiler's Money in the Bank was a parable that could easily be applied to the entire neo-colonial situation of both individuals and entire nations. Second reading comes from an essay in The Shape of That Hurt, and it's entitled Brathwaite with a Dash of Brown. Subtitle, The Grit, the Writer, and the Written Life. The section of the essay I'm reading analyzes Clock, one of my favorite Brathwaite poems, ever since it first appeared in Other Exiles. A lot of people get vexed at me for saying, I love this poem. Roulet's engaged commentary on Clock is preceded by a few paragraphs about another interesting early poem called Arrival, in which Brathwaite writes autobiographically about his arrival as a colonially formed student entering Cambridge University. The discussion of Clock follows, and Roulet connects personal autobiography with the experience of Clock in what turns out to be what Roulet describes as the full process of the creative mind in its journey from the blinding flash of first seeing through more the rootedness in external society towards the darkening of the word. Even an early poem such as Arrival, which is one of the few poems to hint at Brathwaite's personal reaction to Cambridge, a satirical tone serves to conceal the trauma of adjustment to an alien world. the comic description of the sequenced arrival of feet, guts, fingers, arms, and brain of a robot-like persona masks the bewilderment of accommodating to a strange landscape. And Roulet quotes, when the brain arrived, safely transported, telescoped and raped, he unpacked the wired apparatus of his eyes so that he could assess not only surfaces, but doubts and coils. Soon he would play his part. All he awaited was his heart. Roulet looks at the word telescoped. Telescoped is an image of the real narrowness of the colonial mind, which arrives already raped by colonial education. Such skepticism as he learns at Cambridge teaches him to question the packaged deal of the curriculum. Yet his development of a discriminating intellect simply completes the process of dissociation which had begun at home. The protagonist's final state is that of the assembled, expertly programmed and functioning robot, where originally he had arrived as the dismantled and imperfectly programmed colonial robot. His now perfected schizophrenia is suggested in the final image of the zombie, a creature divorced from the actions it's been commanded to perform because its heart and soul have been captured by an evil sorcerer. The tone of this clearly autobiographical poem, semi-comic and wryly self-mocking, masks with dryness its bitterly disillusioned core of feeling and establishes a pattern in Brathwaite's written life whereby autobiography is presented through distancing metaphor and the ego is masked and protected at its shattered center. Clock, first published in Other Exiles and reappearing with changes in jar music, is dedicated to Albert Ayler, one of the few places where this central implosive shattering is directly explored. Yet, even here, the poet distances himself from the protagonist, who is presented in the third person. The trauma of the experience is conveyed through intense and at times difficult imagery in disjointed phrases whose visual separation from each other suggests the imposing shattering of the psyche. The pounding in his dark recalls the dark night of the soul in Donne and Hopkins. Creative illumination is a state of being charred, electrified, and seared by jagged Pentecostal lightning. The inner flowering is also a shattering of the mind's mirror, an implosion within the psyche, causing intense stabbing pain and a sense of derangement. Brathwaite is treading here on dangerous ground. It interstices between mental breakdown and the creative act, between catastrophic shatter of brain cell and a kind of growing. Later, Tony McNeil and Victor Cattell will traverse this painful ground again and again. Clock enacts the full process of the creative mind in its journey from the blinding flash of first seeing through more the rootlessness in external society towards the darkening of the word, referred to by Dylan Thomas as syllabic blood. The revised version of this poem is dedicated to jazz saxophonist Albert Ayler, who died in 1971. Ayler, both avant-gardist and traditional neo-modernist and rooted in the mud of the Mississippi Delta, becomes Brathwaite's double in the poet's quest for a form that is simultaneously rooted in folk culture and capable of exploiting the extremes of contemporary sophistication, a living, active expression on easy terms with all the world. Ayler's career, like Parker's or Dylan Thomas's, is cut short by the clock, against whose persistent beat he lived and played with urgency. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramchand. And thank you indeed to all of our readers today, Dr. Elizabeth Jackson, Dr. Geraldine Skeet, and Dr. Hannah Regis. And thank you all for being with us this afternoon, our in-person audience and those online. I'm Laura Ann Phillips, a second-year student of the MFA in Creative Writing, and we would like to invite you, if you have not thought of doing a program with us, please certainly consider doing so today. We're always open for signing up. And so this week, again, we welcome you to Campus Literature Week. Thank you for being with us this year, 2023. Tomorrow, Friday, please be with us for the rest of the week. Our online meetings tomorrow over the public holiday and our gala on Friday night. So thank you again. Have a good day, everyone. This is Campus Literature Week, celebrating local writers.